Okay,
Here
welcome
we are,
everybody.
week 4.
Um, so do we want to head right into it or do you want to talk about 15 through 21?
Last week we talked about the free market, the importance of free market because it honors private property so much. And we talked about both the separation of powers um, in the 3 branches of government and the separation of powers federally between the federal government and the state government, and then the checks and balances on them. Then we also talked about how important it is to have a written constitution, that the tradition of having it written down, especially as we watch history being revised, how important that is. And then we talked about how, and these are the 2 I always mix up. One is about limited and one's about local. I think limited is
Right.
next. The
Yeah.
limited government, that centralized is never going to go well. It's always better to have it be smaller, which that's why I get them mixed up, because that then we talk about localized government, that it's better to have things, decisions made closer
Closer
to
to home.
home, yeah, than far away, because someone far away doesn't have the same knowledge of what needs to be done and the best way to handle problems. And then we talked about
The majority.
the majority. That was the other one. Having a little brain burp tonight. So
It's okay.
that one's important because they talked about how you have to do your business with the majority, but they really sought for as much consensus as they could because they didn't want the minority to be trampled on. They had seen that happen as well. So we're picking up tonight. There's 7 more principles tonight.
Yeah.
We're starting with 22.
So principle 22 is that a free people should be governed by law and not by the whims of men. So there has to be something set. It can't be by the the emotions of people. Laureen likes to say, off with your head. Um, that's the kind when it's by the whims of men. You don't really have anything to hold on to. You can't look to the law to protect you. So Skousen said to be governed by the whims of men is to be subject to the ever-changing capriciousness of those in power. This is ruler's law at its worst. In such a society, nothing is dependable. No rights are secure. Things established in the present are in a constant state of flux. Nothing becomes fixed and predictable for the future. That's why one of the dangers of executive orders is that that's only while this president's here. You can't make business decisions or even decisions for your individual life if you don't know that this is the law and it's not going to be changed depending upon which political party gets into power.
Did you want to leave the individual screens on the top? I can still see them.
I took mine off, so if you'll go up to the top where those little lines are and hit the one line,
Okay,
then
just
it
as
will
long
take
as
them
it's not
off.
on the recording, I'm fine.
Okay, yeah, I don't think it is.
Okay.
So he went on, the American founders and their Anglo-Saxon forebears had an entirely different point of view. They defined law as a rule of action, which was intended to be as binding on the ruler as it was upon the people. It was designed to give society a stable frame of reference so that the people could feel secure in making plans for the future.
Okay, I have to try to change this because I can't see the slides now.
Oh, okay, can you go up to the top? See those little lines right above the
Oh, yeah, I
picture?
see them, but they're covered up by "Do you want to leave the meeting?" And if I click that, I will go away, which might
Oh, I
not be.
don't.
There we go.
Okay,
Okay. All
sorry.
right. So much fun. We're so happy to
This is
have
what
this
happens when we're in charge.
archive recording. Exactly. Okay, so John Locke, remember, he's one that Thomas Jefferson read. Well, they all did, but we've talked about him earlier, and how closely the Declaration of Independence mirrors so many of his ideas. Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. So even though you choose people to do it, even the people who make those laws, you can laugh now. Maybe again, don't, I hope you're not drinking soda when you read that. Even the people who make the laws are supposed to live by the laws. So many eye rolls because of how far we've departed from this, correct? And then I love this. Aristotle's just, I really like him. Even the best of men in authority are liable to be corrupted by passion. And by passion, he means your emotions. Think of the king that was the king, I can't remember if it was Nebuchadnezzar or if it was the other one, when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. That was totally passion. Well, yeah, this is what we should do. And the next thing you knew, he'd made this horrible law that was going to kill his friend. We may conclude then that the law is reason without passion, and it is therefore preferable to any individual.
And here he says the end of law, meaning the
This
very
is Locke
meaning of
now.
law,
This is
is
Locke
not
now.
is
That's
not
how
to
it is done.
abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. So the reason that we have law is not to abolish our rights. It's not to restrain us as individuals. The reason we have law and the reason for the Constitution is that it's to preserve and enlarge our freedom. And that's our freedom to do good, our freedom to act according to what will bless our lives. And with that, of course, comes our responsibility to allow others to do the same. But when you start to look, this should be a little litmus test when people are wanting to sign petitions or they're wanting to get involved and they have all these emotional arguments. And you need to ask yourself, is this a law that is going to preserve freedom, or is it going to abolish or restrain? And I would think particularly about our Bill of Rights. Is it going to take away my Second Amendment right? Is it going to take away my First Amendment rights? Is this meant to restrain me from speaking freely? Those are the things we need to start thinking about.
I'm sorry, I was trying to talk over you because we had a Locke quote and then an Aristotle quote, and then we had a Locke quote. And I was trying to make sure you knew that that last one was not Aristotle again.
Oh, I think there was a thing at the bottom, but yeah, okay. Well, that's good.
Go
Uh,
ahead, Stacey.
This James Madison quote is so good because it just is like kind of prophetic. He said, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, check, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, check, because we need hundreds of attorneys to tell us what they mean. If they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, check, or if they undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow." That is everything that is happening with our laws today. The Constitution's only 4 pages. I just want to remind you, it's 4 pages long, compared to these 2,000-page bills that are presented to our legislators maybe 2 days before they want you to vote on them.
So this principle is a biggie, and we feel like it could almost have a whole evening of
It
itself
really
as far
could.
as what we've learned in the last 10 to 15 years about the federal Department of Education and what they wanted to do. And a lot of this has actually, it would be good things to study. Kind of a lot of it comes from the United Nations. The principle is that a free society can't survive as a republic without a broad program of general education, because the biggest thing that people wanted to be educated in was how to keep their freedoms. So this one is really important. You can see where we've gone off the beam with this one in modern times.
And I would just say, just so that I don't forget to say, there is a really good book written by David Barton at wallbuilders.com called, and now I can't remember the name of it, 4 Centuries of Education, I think is what it's called. And it is so good. If you want to just have a book that tells you what education started out to be, and then you see where it is today, you will just be amazed at what was taught, about what was um, the theme of most colleges was about Christ as your foundation, compared to where we are today. It is such a good book. And it's little, that's what makes it good.
I can include that in the email.
Oh, that'd be great. So the English colonists in America undertook something which no nation had ever attempted before, the educating of the whole people, everybody. And it started out in these little homes with mothers, or just little in-home schools before they moved to a schoolhouse. And here we learn that the Northwest Ordinance, which we talked about earlier, in religion, which was our fourth principle, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Article 3, directly linked religion and public education together. Listen to what it says again. Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So that is a link to the fact that they knew we needed religion. We have to have religion in order to remain moral, to keep our moral compass. And the knowledge that they wanted taught was how to remain free.
So we had to include this because it's so relevant to what we're talking about. King Mosiah, in the book that we're just reading this right now. If you're doing Come Follow Me, he appointed priests to teach the people that thereby they may hear and know the commandments of God. And then later in that same chapter, it says there was no contention among all his people. It makes it so that people who want to depart from correct principles are the outliers rather than have the people who want to keep the commandments be the outliers. If you've got a program of education that teaches the correct things. And
Right.
Skousen's intention of this kind of education was to have all children taught the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic so that they could go on to become well informed citizens through their own diligent self study. It wasn't to teach them everything. And we would also add here, it wasn't to prepare them for a job. That was, Aristotle called that the training of slaves. Now, remember, we talked about Alexis de Tocqueville coming from France to observe things in America after he had lived through some of the tumultuous political upheavings in France. So when he came, it was in the 1830s. So it was a couple of generations after the founders, but he had made some observations about what he saw as far as how Americans were educating their children. The kinds of things they learned in school were elementary notions of human knowledge, the stuff that Skousen just mentioned, doctrines and evidences of religion. And remember, we talked about there were some commonalities in religion, so it wasn't any state sanctioned church. The history of the country, because they knew there were miracles in the country and they wanted them to know that as well, and the leading features of the Constitution. De Tocqueville observed, quote, it is now think about this. Again, contrast it with today. It is extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon, which just slayed Stacy and me when we came across this. Why we wanted to include it, because you see some of those man on the street interviews where people will ask people, who fought the Revolutionary War, and what was that, and they have no clue who it is. So
And
now,
that's on a college campus.
excuse me.
I'm sorry, that's on a college campus.
Oh, yeah, it's very often on college campuses that the people don't have any idea what they're being asked. This is still de Tocqueville. It cannot be doubted that in the United States, the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the support of the democratic republic. That just stands to reason, doesn't it? And such must always be the case, I believe, where the instruction which enlightens the understanding isn't separated from the moral education. If you question him respecting his own country, he will inform you what his rights are and by what means he exercises them. He will be able to point out the customs which obtain in the political world. You will find that he is well acquainted with the rules of the administration and that he's familiar with the mechanism of the laws. The American learns to know the laws by participating in the act of legislation, and he takes a lesson in the forms of government from governing. The great work of society is ever going on before his eyes and, as it were, under his hands. In the United States, politics are the end and aim of education. And the reason why is so that they could preserve and protect their rights.
I think this speaks too to back to local government where you have smaller parts,
Mhm.
right? It hasn't all been centralized so that you can participate in the governing. And
Mhm.
it just, I don't know, for some reason it just speaks to me because I just think, you know what? It's your turn to be the mayor and now you're gone. And now there's somebody else who's going to participate.
Mhm.
And as long as we all keep participating, then we all keep understanding what's going on before our eyes. Anyway. So this is something that we had to include, and you will find in that David Barton book, The 4 Centuries of Education. This is a response from an Alabama law professor regarding the Federalist Papers because he required them, his doctorate students who were trying to become attorneys, to read the Federalist Papers, and many of them complained to him about how difficult they were to understand. And this was his response.
This is modern day.
Yeah, I understand, he said. This book was not written for someone of your educational level, a doctorate student. This book was written for the common, average, upstate New York farmer of 1787. Perhaps someday you, as a graduate student, will attain the educational level of those early New York farmers. And you think about that now. I've read not all of well, actually, I've gone through all of the Federalist Papers as part of the class. But truly, I had to go slowly, and I had to have people help me because it is higher than me. But I will tell you this, when people say you can't know the intent of the founders, I want you to know that you can read the Federalist Papers and you can absolutely know the intent of the founders. That's that's why I think they're not championed as much as they should be. But it's interesting, isn't it, how our language has changed so much that we can't really understand their language. It is higher than ours. They read the McGuffey readers when they were young, and I got some of those for as a homeschool thing, and it was difficult for me because I did see Dick run. So, do you want to go
You
ahead?
know, the Catholic Church has a catechism that before the kids are confirmed, where they have questions and answers and questions and answers, and the kids are trained before their confirmation to know all these doctrinal points. So, catechism is, while it's a Catholic thing, they actually made, and I don't know, maybe there's other Christian churches that do that as well. I'm not sure as I say that to you, but there's an actual book. You can get it on Amazon. It's like $5. It's a little pamphlet. It's the size of a 8 by 11 sheet of paper, but it's just a thin, almost like a little workbook, and it's called the Catechism on the Constitution. And it is just question, answer, question, and answer. It used to actually be used and studied in schools. This is Skousen. Early Americans knew they were in possession of a unique and valuable invention of political science, and they were determined to promote it on all levels of education. So those kids just grew up knowing that. So then when it was their turn, they knew that that's the only way that good government would work is if everyone shared in it, which is some great words that are used in Mosiah 29, which is the Book of Mormon's founding.
So Daniel Webster said that wherever Americans went, the Bible came with them. And I just thought it just for fun to say that when you read First Nephi 13, you actually see this as well, which I always thought was kind of fun. So I have this quote as a note in my scriptures. But he said, it is not to be doubted that to the free and universal reading of the Bible in that age, men were much indebted for right views of civil liberty. The Bible is a book of faith and a book of doctrine and a book of morals and a book of religion, of especial revelations from God. But it is also a book which teaches man his own individual responsibility, his own dignity, and his equality with his fellow man. So you can see how that aids in helping children grow up, recognizing that um, they have responsibility and they have self-worth, and so do their fellow men.
Skousen said, in our own day, the public schools have been secularized to the point where no Bible reading is permitted. The founding fathers would have counted this as a serious mistake. No, one founder here says this, Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration, and this was in a letter to his friend Jeremy Belknap. I am now preparing an address to be delivered. He was a minister upon the necessity and advantages of teaching children to read by means of the Bible. That's what most everyone used to learn to read. He goes on, I consider this as a matter of more importance in the world than keeping up a regular gospel ministry. And yet, strange to tell, there are religious men and even ministers of the gospel who disapprove of it. The great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effectual means of extirpating Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible in schools.
And it's something to think about because he said that a long time ago, and now we can look and go, well, was that a true statement? And I would say yes. This is interesting too, and this is also in that David Barton book. But in 1892, there was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus Day. And so there was a little booklet prepared by the Kansas Teachers Association. So this is a statement by the state superintendent of public instruction. If the study of the Bible is to be excluded from all state schools, if the inculcation of the principles of Christianity is to have no place in the daily program, if the worship of God is to form no part in the general exercises of these public elementary schools, then the good of the state would be better served by restoring all schools to church control. So that's how they felt back then. I think that
That's a
we,
school board. That is a
yeah, and
school
we
board
have
saying, if
been,
we don't do what we should give this back to this church and that we shouldn't even have public schools.
and we have been led to believe that that was never the thinking, but
Yeah.
we have lost so much of what was really important back then.
While this isn't in the presentation, I think it's something to know and maybe do some your own research on. Two of the most instrumental men in moving education away from its original intent of the founders are two of the men most highly regarded as modern educators and by modern educators. One is Horace Mann. How many schools are named after him? And one is John Dewey. And both of them felt like one of the most important things to do in education for public education was break the influences of homes and families. That is worth your study and research to find that out. George Q. Cannon, is one of the members of the Quorum of the 12 in the late 19th century. And he said, education which leaves out God is destitute of all true value. That's not pussyfooting around. Satan is aware of the great power which a true system of education gives to the people. He is therefore opposed to such a system. He knows full well that a generation trained in all true knowledge cannot be led by him, as they would if their education were neglected. Because if those things are left out, that vacuum is created. That means that falsehoods are not recognized. Then he finishes, he therefore, meaning the adversary, stirs up all the agencies under his control to do everything in their power to defeat the purposes of God in regard to the education of our children.
Kind of an important note, if you really go back and look, that these early apostles and prophets pled with members of the church not to send their children to the free schools for this very reason. President David O. McKay, and this is quoted by President Packer when he was speaking at a symposium, but it's David O. McKay's words back when the Supreme Court stopped prayer in school. And he said, the Supreme Court of the United States has made it unpatriotic for public schools to teach your children to pray. By making that unconstitutional, the Supreme Court severs the connecting cord between the public schools of the United States and the source of divine intelligence, the Creator himself. Evidently, the Supreme Court misinterprets the true meaning of the First Amendment and are now leading this Christian nation down the road to atheism. And here again, President Packer said, moral values are being neglected and prayer expelled from public schools on the pretext that moral teaching belongs to religion. At the same time, atheism, the secular religion, is admitted to class, and our youngsters are proselyted to a conduct without morality. We are caught in a current so strong that unless we correct our course, civilization as we know it will surely be wrecked to pieces. The distance between the church and a world set on a course which we cannot follow will steadily increase.
30 years ago, and that's something.
Go ahead, Laureen.
Okay, and then this is, the School of Education at BYU is called the David O. McKay School of Education. They don't get much of a better education there, I'm sad to say, than they do in any other university. Boyd K. Packer gave them this charge, however, and again, it was nearly 30 years ago. And think how much things have changed in those 30 years. In many places, it's literally not safe physically for youngsters to go to school. And in many schools, and it's becoming almost generally true, it's spiritually unsafe to attend public schools. And we believe that it's absolutely true now. Look back over the history of education to the turn of the century and the beginning of the educational philosophies. Pragmatism and humanism were the early ones, and they branched out into a number of other philosophies, which have led us now into a circumstance where our schools are producing the problems that we face. We thought we'd include this definition to show just how much we've been dumbed down, even as a population, and not just in an educational setting with children at school. This is a dictionary definition from the Noah Webster 1828 dictionary. So this was a typical dictionary entry. Look at how much richness is in this definition of what education is. The bringing up as of a child, instruction, formation of manners, Education comprehends all that series of instruction and discipline which is intended to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, and form the manners and habits of youth, and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. To give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable. And an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. That was in the dictionary. Now, here's today's dictionary.
No,
Oh,
here is just, this is just actually a quote from an address to the graduates at Columbia College, because we wanted to show you that this is actually true. This is actually what they did believe education was, because this is Samuel Johnson, and he said, "You this day have, by the favor of Providence and the attention of friends, received a public education, the purpose whereof hath been to qualify you the better to serve your Creator and your country. Go then, and exercise them with diligence, fidelity, and zeal. Your first great duties are those you owe to heaven, to your Creator and Redeemer. Let these be ever present to your minds and exemplified in your lives and conduct." Can you imagine sitting through your child's graduation ceremony and having this be the address that they hear? And so now Laureen has the final pride of today.
This is the contrast of the definition we read first. This is today's dictionary online, the Merriam-Webster. The action or process of teaching someone, especially, and look, there's only this one setting, a school, college, or university. And then it says it again, the knowledge, skill, and understanding that you get where? From attending a school, college, or university. A field of study that deals with the methods and problems of teaching. That's it. Big difference
Big difference.
in a couple of hundred years.
Go ahead.
This principle is quite interesting. It says a free people will not survive unless they stay strong. And there's great debate about this. But notice that there's a common thread in all of the quotes we've chosen from the founders. And like I said, there's more in the book if you've got the book. Franklin said, our security, meaning the security of the nation, our security lies, I think, in our growing strength, both in numbers and wealth. That creates an increasing ability of assisting this nation in its wars, which will make us more respectable, our friendship with other countries, he means, more valued, and our enmity feared. Thence it will soon be thought proper to treat us not with justice only, but with kindness. And thence we may expect in a few years a total change of measures with regard to us. We have seen this change drastically just in the course of our lifetimes in different presidential administrations, depending on our foreign policy. It's so interesting that you can test and measure and see when we have been feared and respected in the world and when we have not, by the way we're treated. This principle shows up in the Book of Mormon all the time, too.
Franklin also said, "Were this union formed, were we once united, thoroughly armed and disciplined, so we have some responsibility here, were everything in our power done for our security as far as human means and foresight could provide, we might then, with more propriety, humbly ask the assistance of heaven and a blessing on our lawful endeavors." And that you can find that in the scriptures as well. Those who were prepared spiritually, especially, could call upon heaven and have the blessings in their favor. But when we do nothing to protect ourselves and we get caught off guard, the Lord lets us answer for our choices.
George Washington said, there is a rank due to the United States among nations, which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. And Franklin said this again too. They that are on their guard and appear ready to receive their adversaries are in much less danger of being attacked than the supine, secure, and negligent. And we had to look up that word supine because I knew it meant something about kind of lying around, but the dictionary actually used moral indolence. And again, to just be reading what happens to King Noah's people this week, you can just see that's when you're in danger of being attacked. When you're supine, secure, thinking nothing can hurt you, and negligent.
Samuel Adams said, "It is the greatest absurdity to suppose that it would be in the power of one or any number of men at the entering into society to renounce their essential natural rights or the means of preserving those rights, when the grand end of civil government, from the very nature of its institution, is for the support, protection, and defense of those very rights." So this kind of speaks to just your ability to defend yourself. Why would you possibly say, "Oh, yes, I would love to be part of your society," as you strip me of my ability to protect myself and protect my home and my family, as you take away my rights? Nobody would sign up for that, because the very reason that we have government is to what? The very end of government is to protect and preserve our rights. And so it makes no sense to think that we would give up those rights. He went on, "It is the business of America to take care of herself. Her situation, as you justly observe, depends upon her own virtue." And so we have this question for you to ponder for a minute. Why do strength and virtue go together?
That's something to really consider too when we start to get into the war chapters with Captain Moroni, because you can tell the thing he focuses on right alongside the physical preparations is their spiritual preparation. Now, this isn't that, but another example from the Book of Mormon. The Lord did cease to preserve them by his miraculous power, for they had fallen into a state of unbelief and awful wickedness. This is in the early part of Helaman. Thus, they had become weak because of their transgressions. And this is one of the reasons we've really realized that obedience is a natural law, and that it's almost like it's not like the Lord is petulantly withholding blessings from us. Nope, you're not obeying me, so I'm not going to do that for you. It's like, I can't bless you when you don't obey. I'm thinking there's lots more natural consequences of what he can do and what he can't do, what he must do and what he must not do when we obey and when we disobey. Go ahead, Stacy.
So the 25th principle, and this is an important one to kind of understand, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That should get our attention as we go through this and see if the things that they talk about don't make sense to us.
That's a great foreign policy that is not followed anymore.
Yeah. The founders kind of believed in separatism versus isolationism. These are some of the things. They wanted to cultivate a wholesome relationship with all nations. They wanted to remain aloof from sectional quarrels and international disputes, to avoid alliances of friendship with one nation, which would make us enemies then of another nation in a time of crisis. And they wanted to keep the American markets open to all countries unless there were certain countries that engaged in hostilities towards us. Washington said, "Observe good faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct," which is always the thread throughout all of the principles, I believe. "And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence." That was the goal. Of course, they didn't, exhibit it perfectly all of the time, but that was the goal. It was a high goal.
Washington also said the nation which indulges toward another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. And you can really think about that. Listen to what he says. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and interest. So suddenly your national interests are not the top priority. If we're friends with you, we have to hate the enemies of, we have to hate your enemies, and we have to give favors that we wouldn't otherwise give to your friends. And we want to just be neutral to them. Then he also says, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. And I think I should have said that conjure. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial. else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided instead of a defense against it. So, what he warned about as far as becoming a slave, he said, if you're not impartial to every country, that's what you're going to get.
I think I looked up the word conjure, and I think it just means I plead. I plead
Mhm.
with you to believe me. So separatism was replaced by internationalism.
And oh, wasn't it?
There were powerful influences congregating in the US, particularly the financial circles who wanted America in the thick of things worldwide. And that you look into the financial circles, follow the
Mhm.
money, and you can usually find the problem. Their opportunity came with World War I. Congressional investigations by the Reese Committee revealed that long before the sinking of the Lusitania, which is what they said is why we must go, these influences were agitating for U.S. involvement.
This is a fascinating quote. Charles Lindbergh Sr. was the pilot's father, and he served in Congress, and he talked about World War One. We just always think that it was an imperative that we got into those two world wars. But listen to these last two quotes that finish this principle in the chapter. Take for example, so this is Lindbergh. Take for example our entry into the World War. So he's talking 1917 at 1917 at that time. We did not think. We elected a president for a second term because he said he kept us out of war in this first term. By the way, I want to stop parenthetically and tell you that is what Woodrow Wilson ran on in 1914, is that he had kept them out of World War One. And 4 months after his second term started, they got into the war. This is now Lindbergh again. We proved by a large vote that we did not want to go to war, but no sooner was the president reelected than the propaganda started to put us to war. That's the stirring up we're always talking about. Then we became hysterical, as people always have done in war, and we believed everything bad against our enemy and believed only good of our allies and ourselves. This is a pattern. He's talking about a specific war, but this is a pattern. You see it over and over in the Book of Mormon. As a matter of fact, all the leaders were bad, vicious. They lost their reason, and the people followed. We cannot properly blame the people of any of the European nations unless we blame ourselves. None of them were free from danger of the others. We, however, were not in danger. Statements by profiteers and militarists to the contrary, notwithstanding. So he's speaking to that propaganda again. The greatest good we could do the world at that time was to stay out. And that would have been infinitely better for ourselves, for we could have helped the world had we conserved our resources, because nothing drains the world's resources like a war. There never was a nation that did a more unstatesmanlike thing than we did to enter the war. We came out without establishing a single principle for which we entered. The one compelling duty of America is to put its own house in shape and to stand upon an economic system that will make its natural resources available to the intelligence, industry, and use of the people. When we do that, the way to world redemption from the folly of present chaos will stand out in our country so clearly, honestly, and usefully that we shall be copied wherever peoples do their own thinking. Is that a great quote or what? Like I said, this is at the end of the chapter of chapter 25.
And, sometimes, especially when we read this next quote, I think everybody will stop and pause and wonder, and that's okay. We've all stopped, paused, and wondered. I will say, though, that the book that Laureen and I talked about last week, none dare call it a conspiracy, except there's an updated one called Call It a Conspiracy, will help you understand these quotes better, I believe. They
I
help.
highly recommend it.
Yeah. So then this is J. Reuben Clark, who was former Undersecretary of State and a former ambassador to Mexico and also a member of the first presidency.
For
Um,
decades, for
yeah.
decades.
So, and I will just say this too, and if I haven't said it before, and that is that J. Reuben Clark, Cleon Skousen, and Ezra Taft Benson all individuals who actually served high up in government and who warned and warned about communism are the three that were the most maligned, the three
In our
that
church.
actually had the most information about it. So I find that interesting. Um, so this is what he says about World War II. He said, America, multi-raced and multi-nationed, is by tradition, by geography, by citizenry, by natural sympathy, and by material interest, the great neutral nation of the earth. God so designed it. Drawn from all races, creeds, and nations, our sympathies run to every oppressed people. Our feelings engaged on opposite sides of great differences will, in their natural course, if held in due and proper restraint, neutralize the one with the other. No, that didn't work. Directed in right channels, this great body of feeling for the one side or the other will ripen into sympathy and love for all misguided and misled fellow men who suffer in any cause, and this sympathy and love will run out to all humanity in its woe. One of the great tragedies of the war, World War II, now starting, is that every people now engaged in it have been led into it without their fully knowing just where they are bound. The people themselves are largely innocent of this slaughter. As the great neutral of the earth, America may play a far greater part in this war. It is our solemn duty to play a better part than we can do by participating in the butchery. Having in mind our position as the great world neutral, and remembering that the people of these warring nations have been led into this conflict largely unwittingly, and therefore are largely blameless, we should announce our unalterable opposition to any plan to starve these innocent peoples involved in this conflict, the women, the children, the sick, the aged, and the infirm, and declare that when actual and bona fide mass starvation shall come to any of them, no matter who they are, we shall do all that we properly may do to see that they are furnished with food. If we shall rebuild our lost moral power and influence by measures such as these, which will demonstrate our love for humanity, our justice, our fair-mindedness, we shall then be where we can offer mediation between the two belligerents. America, the great neutral, will thus become the peacemaker of the world, which is her manifest destiny if she lives the law of peace. So those are interesting quotes about whether or not we should have entered the war. I think when we do further study, I think that we can come to understand these quotes better. But sometimes we get nervous because we think, well, we had to stop them. But there may have been other ways that we could have.
We love this principle also. The 26, remember there's 28. We're rounding the finish line here. We're coming up to the finish line. 26 says the core unit which determines the strength of any society is the family. Therefore, the government should foster and protect its integrity. And we had a book to recommend about this too that I'm going to put in the email. We'll talk about that in a minute. Alexis de Tocqueville, again, when he came, said, there is certainly no country in the world where the tie of marriage is more respected than in America, or where conjugal happiness is more highly or worthily appreciated. Now, let me tell you what I thought about when we're reading this. Somebody came to my mind. Listen to this picture of an unhappy, tumultuous home. In Europe, almost all the disturbances of society arise from the irregularities of domestic life. To despise the natural bonds and legitimate pleasure of home is to contract a taste for excesses, a restlessness of heart, and fluctuating desires. Agitated by the tumultuous passions that frequently disturb his dwelling, the European is galled by the obedience which the legislative powers of the state exact. But when the American retires from the turmoil of public life to the bosom of his family, he finds in it the image of order and peace. There, his pleasures are simple and natural. His joys are innocent and calm. And as he finds that an orderly life is the surest path to happiness, he accustoms himself easily to moderate his opinions as well as his tastes. While the European endeavors to forget his domestic troubles by agitating society, the American derives from his own home that love of order which he afterwards carries with him into public affairs. The thing that struck me about that more than anything else, and obviously that is a huge generalization, there would be people now that would just have their panties in a wad over that statement, that of course there's tumultuous families in America, and of course there's peaceful families in Europe, and we're not arguing that. We're not even making that point. But to point out this pattern, I think, is fascinating. And the first person I thought of when I thought of someone unhappy at home that could never maintain a happy home was Karl Marx. That's the person I thought of when he was describing that. And I'll just leave you to your thoughts about that.
Well, I think that the pattern is the point and not the country. And I think that we can look to our own country now and see
Oh, because we've got that.
what is happening. And generally speaking, those who cannot find peace and happiness and control in their own home seek to control the lives of others.
Mhm.
Benjamin Franklin gave this counsel to a younger friend who was considering taking a mistress, and we love this. He said to him, "Marriage is the proper remedy. It is the most natural state of man, and therefore the state in which you are most likely to find solid happiness. Your reasons against entering into it at present appear to me not well founded. The circumstantial advantages you have in view by postponing it are not only uncertain, but they are small in comparison with that of the thing itself, the being married and settled. It is the man and woman united that make the complete human being. Separate, she wants his force of body and strength of reason. He, her softness, sensibility, and acute discernment. Together, they are more likely to succeed in the world. A single man has not nearly the value he would have in that state of union. He is an incomplete animal, and we like this part. He resembles the odd half of a pair of scissors. If you get a prudent, healthy wife, your industry in your profession, with her good economy, will be a fortune sufficient."
Great counsel to marriage. Locke stated that parental authority is based on principles of natural law. We love this. Listen to what he says about what parents should be doing for their children. The power then that parents have over their children arises from that duty which is incumbent on them to take care of their offspring during the imperfect state of childhood. And by imperfect here, he means incomplete. They're not full adults. To inform the mind and govern the actions of their yet ignorant nonage, that means not age, till reason shall take its place. So before they know to do it with reason, it's our job to do that for them. And ease them of that trouble is what children want, and the parents are bound to provide. When he has acquired that state of maturity, he's presumed to know how far the law is to be his guide and how far he may make use of his freedom. Till then, somebody else must guide him, who is presumed to know how far the laws allow a liberty. Till then, we see the laws allow the son to have no will, but he is to be guided by the will of his father or guardian, who is to understand for him. But after that age of maturity is obtained, the father and son are equally free, as much as tutor and pupil after nonage, equally subjects of the same law together, without any dominion left in the father over the life, liberty, or estate of his son. The nourishment and education of their children during that time of minority is a charge so incumbent on parents for their children's good that nothing can absolve them from taking care of it. I think of this often when I watch parents not fully understand. I've heard parents with very young children sometimes allow them to do things and say, well, they've got their agency. And I'm thinking this speaks to a different way to parent that's very important. It's our job to train them in their agency. And Locke seems to say that and know that.
This is what he says the responsibility of children will be to their parents. He said, "As he, God, hath laid on them," the parents, "an obligation to nourish, preserve, and bring up their offspring, so he has laid on the children a perpetual obligation of honoring their parents, which, containing in it an inward esteem and reverence, to be shown by all outward expressions, ties up the child from anything that may ever injure or affront, disturb or endanger the happiness or life of those from whom he received his life, and engages him in all actions of defense, relief, assistance, and comfort of those by whose means he entered into being, and has been made capable of any enjoyments of life. From this obligation, no state, no freedom can absolve children." So I have always loved this quote because it speaks to how children should reverence and respect their parents and treat them um, as they get older and as it becomes more of your responsibility as a child to help care for your parents. And I think that sometimes in Asian countries, it seems that they may do this better than we do here.
So this principle really boils down to the state must not interfere with legitimate family relations. Any laws that are going to supplant family sovereignty is not going to be wise policy. Skousen said about that, it will be appreciated that the strength and stability of the family is of such vital importance to the culture that any action by the government to debilitate or cause dislocation in the normal trilateral structure of the family becomes not merely a threat to the family involved, but a menace to the very foundations of society itself. Notice he says trilateral structure. He is talking about God and parents and children under God. But like I said, that duty flows to the parents to train the children. So it's not just a harm, a potential harm to a family, an individual family. When families break down, it affects the culture, which, is just right in our proclamation.
Neil Maxwell said, since no other institution can compensate fully for failure in the family, why then, instead of enhancing the family, the desperate search for substitutes? Why not require family impact studies before proceeding with this program or that remedy, since of all environmental concerns, the family should be first? Hundreds of governmental departments and programs protect various interests, but which one protects the family?
We had a speaker come to a study group we used to go to more regular. We're still a part of this group called the United Women's Forum, but there was a speaker years ago who talked about the Division of Child Protective Services, which we think of as being something to protect children. But she said, even this was a good 10 years ago, that it troubled her that policy leaned more towards taking children out of homes than keeping them in. They usually entered homes with the idea, how can we get these children out of this home? And she found that troubling to have that be the default setting going in. Oh, do you want me to do this, Stacey?
I do, and then I want you to tell your story.
Oh, that's right, because we just talked about this the other day. Okay. So now these are words from the Proclamation on the Family, so they should be familiar to you. We warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. So, in other words, if there are laws that say, possibly again, that someone could come in and take your child because they're not safe, because you are not going to support their gender dysphoria, that would be a bad law. I use that as my example because the other day I read someplace, Michael Knowles is someone I quite enjoy. He's a contributor on Daily Wire, and he's a devout Catholic. And someplace there was a story. I only found out about the story because of something he tweeted, and I'm not on X, but this came across my wake somehow. I think it was in an email or something, maybe from the Daily Wire. But he got wind of a story that KSL News had published on their website, where they called his views of gender ideology extreme far right. Because as a devout Catholic, he believes that men are men and women are women, and there are only two genders. Something which, again, is earlier in this proclamation. So the reason we're bringing it up now is because bless this man's heart, this good man's heart. So as a Catholic, knowing that KSL has strong ties to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, his rebuttal, he posted the story from KSL calling him that, and then he posted our proclamation on the family, which he said, I may not know everything doctrinally or agree with everything doctrinally that this church believes in, but politically, I believe in everything this document says. So I just found that just good for him. Good for him. And shame on KSL.
Yeah. So that leads us to the 27th principle, and this will just be something that's just so heartwarming. The burden of debt is as destructive to freedom as subjugation by conquest. They believe that there was nothing more troubling than debt. And when you consider the place that we're in right now, it's scary to think about.
I asked her to include that slide.
Yeah. We have this video for you to watch. It's called Don't Buy Stuff You Can't Afford. Just enjoy for a minute. Turn your volume up.
Just can't get these numbers to add up.
Like we're never going to get out of this hole.
Credit card debt, does it ever end?
Anyway, something that we should send to all of our legislators. Benjamin Franklin said, but think what you do when you run in debt. You give to another power over your liberty. If you cannot pay at the time, you will be ashamed to see your creditor. You will be in fear when you speak to him. You will make poor, pitiful, sneaking excuses, and by degrees come to lose your veracity and sink into base, downright lying. For as poor Richard says, the second vice is lying, the first is running in debt. And again, to the same purpose, lying rides upon debt's back. Poverty often deprives a man of all spirit and virtue. 'Tis hard for an empty bag to stand upright, as poor Richard truly says. We love that because he is poor Richard, so he's quoting himself. But it's true, those are the things that happen when you get into trouble and you start lying about it, you start sneaking around, and you hope nobody will, confront you about it. And then you sometimes just start pointing your finger at somebody else's fault.
Thomas Jefferson said, there does not exist an engine so corruptive of the government and so demoralizing of the nation as public debt. It will bring on us more ruin at home than all the enemies from abroad. And Skousen said the founding fathers felt that the wars, economic problems, and debts of one generation should be paid for by that generation which incurred them. They wanted the rising generation to be genuinely free, both politically and economically. They felt that leaving a debt to their children was the worst kind of taxation without representation, as those future generations didn't have an opportunity to vote on the indebtedness.
Skousen said, besides the bad practice of not hastening to pay off debts due to war, another difference has been a profligate explosion in the cost of government operations. And then if you look in your books, if those of you that have books, there are charts. We don't have any time to go through, but they're worth looking at on pages 298 and 299. But Skousen said, beginning with the era of the Great Depression, all three branches of the federal government used the climate of emergency. Now, just think about that in our own lives. The climate of emergency to overstep their constitutional authority and aggressively undertake to perform tasks not authorized by the founders. Extensive studies by Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman, who we've already heard from, have demonstrated that every one of these adventures into non-constitutional activities proved counterproductive, some of them tragically so. Secondly, the people were induced to believe that these serious aberrations of constitutional principles would provide a shortcut to economic prosperity. It gave the people the illusion that by spending vast quantities of borrowed money, they would prosper, when, as a matter of fact, the outcome was exactly the opposite, just as the founders had predicted it. That is a violation of natural law as well.
You may hear the name John Keynes. When they talk about Keynesian economics, that's what they're talking about: spending your way into prosperity, and utilizing debt. And it's faulty economics.
Again, read
Doctor,
that book.
oh,
Sorry.
did you want me to?
No, I want you to read this, but I was just saying, again, read that book, call it a conspiracy. You
It
will
really
get
is.
so much more.
We can't recommend it highly enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Friedman points out that after the federal government had spent many billions of dollars and had seriously meddled with constitutional structure of the nation, the unemployment rate was higher in 1938 than it had been in 1932. So 6 years into the New Deal, had not, and then this is Friedman talking, had not the crisis of World War II suddenly emerged, which required the spending of many additional billions of borrowed dollars and also resulted in absorbing the unemployed workforce, the fiscal failure of the New Deal experiments would be better remembered by the American people. We've just been, as we've studied this, we've come to realize that FDR is considered to be just this great president, and we're not seeing it. After studying this, we're just not seeing it.
Skousen said, it is the very essence of human nature to pursue this disastrous course once the appetite has been created to demand it. And you think about all of the programs that we have today that that we all have or do now participate in that are outside of constitutional authority. When it comes to cutting programs and reducing costs, balancing the budget, and eliminating deficit spending, it is amazing how few will make the necessary adjustment without the most violent outcries of protest when it affects them personally. And Neil Maxwell said Goliath does not go to surgery, peacefully? Was it Lorraine? I can't remember.
Gently.
Gently. Yeah,
And
because
that's by design. It's by design
it
to
is
have
by design.
everyone have their own sacred cow. Well, don't touch my piece of that pie. Don't touch my program. Well, I want to have a discount on my solar panels, or I want to have cash for clunkers, or but I've got WIC. What about my food stamps? And there's different pieces of that pie that never ever should have been divvied up for the general welfare like it had been. So everybody has an outcry when it looks like you're going to try to trim that instead of going, this isn't what self-governing self-reliance looks like. If we want to get back to that, everyone's going to have to make sacrifices. And like I said, when the whole thing crashes because it can't be sustained anyway, you're going to have to get used to it with anyway being without.
Right.
Oh,
So
last one.
yeah, to the 28th principle. Let's see how we're doing. Pretty good. We'll do this pretty fast. The United States has a manifest destiny to be an example and a blessing to the entire human race. So manifest destiny, can sometimes be used negatively, but the idea here was they wanted to be a blessing to the entire human race.
That
John,
connotation has been there by design. They've tried to
sure,
make it sound like a exploitive,
right.
colonial, yeah, and that's not what it was ever meant to be.
Along with so many other things that have been inserted into our dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
John Adams said, I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a grand scene and design in Providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth.
I love that. And then Fisk was a historian. He wrote this about the founding. This steadfast faith in an unseen ruler and guide was to them a pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. He's making reference to the Israelites in the wilderness. It was of great moral value. It gave them clearness of purpose and concentration of strength, and contributed toward making them, like the children of Israel, a people of indestructible vitality and aggressive energy.
Skousen points out a difference between a sense of mission and what he calls a spirit of perverted chauvinism associated with the idea of racial superiority. The former is a call to exemplary leadership and service. The latter is the arrogant presumption of a self-appointed role to conquer and rule.
And we did have leaders who thought that, but that was not the intent of the founders.
And I think
Thomas
it's started in our education as well.
Oh, it absolutely has. Yeah. Thomas Jefferson looked upon the development of freedom under the Constitution as the world's best hope, and wrote to John Dickinson that what had been accomplished in the United States will be a standing monument and example for the aim and imitation of the people of other countries. Every time they thought that, they thought, we want to have something that other countries want to look to that will better their people.
Alexander Hamilton said, it has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So it is by reflection and thinking and studying history and choosing to be moral and virtuous that you can be in charge of your own destiny rather than having other people act upon you.
Madison also talks, it makes it sound so like it's miraculous almost. Is it not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they've not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience? They didn't just keep things the way they were because that's the way they always had been. To this manly spirit, posterity will be indebted for the possession and the world for the example of the numerous innovations displayed on the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness. I love that he puts them that way because private rights lead to public happiness. But
Oh,
if you put public happiness first, it does not always lead to private rights being honored.
okay. You're gonna have to skip down to had, because I apparently didn't fix this slide very well.
Where do you want me to skip?
Well, it
Oh,
looks like,
had. Gotcha.
yeah.
Had no important step been taken by the leaders of the revolution for which a precedent could not be discovered, no government established of which an exact model did not present itself, the people of the United States might have been laboring under the weight of some of those forms which have crushed the liberties of the rest of mankind if they hadn't taken a look at things and made their own mind up. And then I love this last part. Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race. They pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society, and that is still true 250 years later. They reared the fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. They formed the design of a great confederacy, which it is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate. We've got to get back to be able to do that.
So when you consider the fragile state of our country under the Articles of Confederation, we talked about that there was so much discord between the states and we had massive debt from the war and we had inflated money. How long did it take living under these principles to see positive results? This is just one of 3 letters that we had um, from previous presentations that were written by George Washington. Now, this was written sometime between 1790 and 1791. Well, I guess it says down at the bottom because we had 3, 1790. So he became president in 1789. So here it's just kind of interesting that he says, you have doubtless, speaking to Lafayette, been informed from time to time of the happy progress of our affairs. The principal difficulties seem in a great measure to have been surmounted. Our revenues have been considerably more productive than it was imagined they could be. I mention this to show the spirit of enterprise that prevails. And in each of the letters that he writes, he always is genuinely surprised that things are going so well and
So
changing for the
quickly.
better so quickly. And if you look about in your scriptures, you know, you read about the wars and the contention, and then you see where they come in and begin to teach the people about God, and pretty soon there never was a happier people among the people of Nephi. I mean, it can turn around when people turn around and change um, and look back to God and unite, I would say, under these principles. When people say we must unite and compromise, let's unite and compromise around these principles.
Yeah. Now, look when David O. McKay said this, 1952. We're talking 70 years ago. During the first half of the 20th century, we have traveled far into the soul destroying land of socialism and made strange alliances through which we have become involved in almost continuous hot and cold wars over the whole of the earth. In this retreat from freedom, the voices of protesting citizens have been drowned by raucous riots of intolerance and abuse from those who led the retreat and their millions of gullible youth who are marching merrily to their doom, carrying banners on which are emblazoned such intriguing and misapplied labels as social justice, equality, reform, patriotism, and social welfare. Isn't that incredible that even some of the language is the same?
Gordon B. Hinckley said, we are involved in an intense battle. It is a battle between right and wrong, between truth and error, between the design of the Almighty on the one hand and that of Lucifer on the other. For that reason, we desperately need moral men and women who stand on principle to be involved in the political process. Otherwise, we abdicate power to those whose designs are almost entirely selfish. I think that's a place where we all fall short and could do better in studying these principles and then participating in the political process in a way that can help bring about the changes that we need.
This is interesting because this is a scripture that we actually were asked to study specifically in General Conference last month. Um, in the 109th section, which is the dedicatory prayer to the Kirtland Temple, Joseph Smith wrote in that prayer, may those principles which were so honorably and nobly defended, namely the Constitution of our land by our fathers, be established forever. And one of the very first classes we took about some of these things taught us that the prophets, the early prophets of our dispensation, taught the Constitution will be the law of the land in the second coming. That will be the method of government.
And so that is actually the conclusion of this class. It is those principles that we need to study. And we are so grateful that you would take this class, and we truly plead with you to continue to study these things and to love them, to teach
Share
them.
them.
Anybody within your sphere of influence, we are just little pebbles that we drop in the water, and we're not going to reach thousands of people at once like others do. But we pray with all of our hearts that each of you will have a desire to share these things with your children, your grandchildren, your friend circle, the people at work, whomever, that there is hope for this country, and that it lies in returning to God and to these principles, which are truly his laws.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm going to
Any
stop the
questions? Like I said, we just go like a freight train because there's just so much to cover. If you got questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. We've got a few things we're going to stick in an email this week besides the recording for today's class.